Welcome back to Eagle Forum's YouTube channel. We're here once again. I'm Colleen Holcomb here with Schlafly Cori, and we're here today to discuss episode 3 of Mrs. America. This episode is entitled Shirley. It focuses on Shirley Chisholm and her presidential run, although we still hear a lot about Phyllis and the other ladies involved in the fight surrounding the Equal Rights Amendment. And I wanted to start by just asking you about your take on this episode, on this focus on Shirley Chisholm's run for president. What do you think about this episode?
Well, they have made a big issue of race, and they call it intersectionality between the feminists, the white feminists, the black feminists, and the friction among them. But they also make a big issue about abortion rights. And this episode takes place, a great part of it, the 1972 Democratic National Convention, where Gloria Steinem is insisting on a plank on abortion rights in the platform, and also insisting that there be no speaker in favor of a pro-life position at the convention. Now, this is disingenuous by the producers. They have purposely left out characters who were very important in the Democratic Party and in the pro-life movement. So number one, they left out Dr. Mildred Jefferson, who was the first African-American woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. And she was one of the most outspoken people early on in the 1970s in favor of a pro-life position and against abortion. And yes, she was a Black woman who strongly felt that abortion hurt at most the Black community, and she inspired so many people. So to present the idea that Shirley Chisholm was representing Black women in the 1970s misses the pro-life position that was a very strong undercurrent throughout the African-American community, as it is today. The other woman they missed is Ellen McCormick. And after Roe v. Wade in 1973, which legalized abortion throughout the United States, there was a group of Catholic women who were Democrats who were very strongly opposed to it. So this show tries to portray Shirley Chisholm as groundbreaking because she was the first woman to run for the Democratic nomination. And they even show her with Secret Service protection. Well, it was actually Ellen McCormick in 1976 who was the first woman to get enough votes and raise enough money to have Secret Service protection. She was the first woman to appear in debates with the other presidential candidates. So they have ignored the pro-life contingent and the pro-life force in the Democratic Party, which was, of course, the Democratic Party was always had a strong Roman Catholic voter base, and the Roman Catholic voter base objected to the Democrats being pro-abortion. And why isn't this shown in this movie? They are selective in choosing how strong the opposition was.
And there's a very deliberate attempt to make abortion synonymous with women's rights. It just seems like that's a seamless argument that a fight for abortion is a fight for women's rights. And
the producer has described those as opposed to ERA as, quote, anti-woman, unquote. That is from the producer's words. And I think if you call Phyllis Schlafly and the women who supported her and the women who were opposed to, who were in favor of pro-life, if you call them and you're willing to call them anti-woman, then you don't really understand where they come from and what their message is.
Right. Right. And you don't really understand what it is that women truly want from our political leaders, as I think recent elections have shown. Going back to the depiction of Phyllis in this episode, and we left it out of, we saw your Aunt Eleanor Schlafly, who was shown in episode 1. She was depicted as kind of a dowdy spinster. She kind of put upon the woman who ended up taking care of the domestic duties that the feminists seem to be intimating that Phyllis abandoned in order to do what she did. Is that an accurate depiction? We see Aunt Eleanor show up again in episode 3. Was that an accurate depiction of Eleanor Schlafly?
No, they use Eleanor Schlafly to say that Phyllis was anti-single woman, which is not at all the case. Eleanor Schlafly was not very domestic oriented. She never lived in our house. And she was glamorous, and she ran her own organization for 50 years, and she was a powerhouse of a woman. And from my perspective, when Phyllis and Eleanor were in a room together, Eleanor dominated. But they're trying to make a point that Phyllis only cared about married women with children. And I think if you look at her organization and the people who were attracted to her, as opposed to making the composite fictional characters that they've done, you would see a number of accomplished single women who saw this kind of forced equality to be harmful to them. And it wasn't just that ERA would be bad for married women or mothers. It would be bad for all women. And there were plenty of single women attracted to the cause and who did work with my mother. And the fact that they selectively ignore these strong, powerful women, whether it was Dot Slade in North Carolina or Olive Spann in Alabama or Penny Pullen in Illinois or even Eleanor Schlafly in Missouri, means that they are ignoring another part of this story in order to tell their own version of the events.
Absolutely. And in order to make Phyllis look like she was an abandoning mother. You've addressed that very articulately, but can you address that point? Did you feel like your mother abandoned you for the cause of?
Well, I'll tell you, my mother was a coddling mother. She coddled her children, and she never wanted her children out of her sight. If anything, I think my mother over-mothered. She never under-mothered. She was very intense about her children and their well-being all of our lives. In fact, I'd say at some points I wish that my mother was a little less mothering.
That was a point that was made by one of Phyllis's biographers, Carol Felsenthal, who was a paid consultant to Mrs. America. She said that in talking to other family members, the Schlafly Six, as she called them, if anything, they suffered from too much maternal attention. So that seemed to be the consensus. But of course, we know there's an agenda here. Now, you mentioned the Democratic National Convention being covered in this episode, and in contrast to this big rally that we saw, the big push for women's rights and for abortion, this episode also depicts the first Stop ERA meeting. And we're introduced to some very interesting characters.
Fictional characters. Remember, they don't bother to learn the real characters that are. But they decided that episode 3 needed to be about race, and they wanted to show one side is good and one side is bad, and that is a lie.
Can you tell us about some of the original members of Stop ERA that you remember? For example, Charlotte Felt, who was the wife of Arthur Felt, who was the very well-respected editor of the Louisiana Times-Picayune. She, in her own right, was president of the Chamber of Commerce back in the 1950s. I understand it's women like her who were some of the original members.
Yes, Charlotte Felt was one of the leaders in Louisiana, along with Marilyn Thayer, and instead they manufacture a character named Mary Frances. And one of the things that I think is that we're being set up for is that this fictional character comes to Phyllis and says, you got to do something about these Southern women. And then Phyllis seems to throw her under the bus and blame her for bringing it up. Well, that was not how my mother operated an organization. And I think it's important for us all to remember that women were loyal to Phyllis because Phyllis was loyal to them. I mean, the idea that she would hang somebody out to dry is a total mischaracterization, and I think setting us up for down the road where this fictional character is going to turn on Phyllis.
I think you're right. If the previews hold true, it seems to be the trajectory that they seem to be taking. And it's been interesting because Mary Frances is the gift that keeps on giving to the liberals. We've seen a lot of liberal publications that have referenced Mary Frances as if she were an actual character when she's not. Does she resemble anybody you have ever seen before?
No. And they have been trying to make a racial accusation for some time against my mother. I had this, NPR made this accusation to me a couple of years ago. It is manufactured out of whole cloth because they believe that in order that they want to slime her by hoping this sticks. But first, let's get our facts right. My mother talked about sex. She didn't talk about race. My mother's organization did not exclude or deny or have or from any African American and one of the things that was so great about Eagle Forum is the way we brought together disparate groups of people. And you see many organizations are narrow, whether they're one particular religion or one particular area, but everybody has always known about Eagle Forum is that we are broad. From the beginning, our organization has not only had women of different religious faiths, but women of different races and women of different political parties. And so I think this broad coalition is something that needs to be celebrated and not try to make divisions that never existed.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think it's really sad on both sides. The program seems to indicate that both sides have this mean girl component where they're both fighting and both kind of talking about the other ones behind their backs. I know from Eagle Forum meetings, we didn't have time for things like that. Phyllis, when you go to an Eagle Forum meeting, it is scheduled from morning until well into the evening. And
well, that is true. My mother always liked things overscheduled, not underscheduled. And also, there was no time for that kind of gossipy, catty backbiting that they seem to show. I mean, I feel as though I'm in junior high school watching Mrs. America.
It's true. And those are just not the types of women that Phyllis attracted. Phyllis always attracted the kinds of ladies who were there to do the serious
worker bees.
They were worker bees there to protect the country. And I have here, this is section 2 of Eagle Forum's this is our bylaws, and it says, Eagle Forum supports all rights of individuals guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, plus the right to equal opportunity at employment and education for all persons, regardless of race, creed, gender, age, or national origin. And there's been no change to that since it was originally written by Phyllis. And
that is who Eagle Forum is. We welcome anybody who comes along with our core beliefs, and our core beliefs are the conservative view of strong families, strong economy, a free economy, and a strong national defense to protect both of them.
Well, on the subject of a strong national defense, the episode closes with a scene where Phyllis is stocking her bunker. Did your mother maintain a bunker?
Well, no, we did not have a bunker. I think at one point she got some dried food that was supposedly good for 25 years, that in case of emergency, you would have a food supply. That was never consumed, and I think it was sort of an idea of, well, maybe we should just stock some stuff up, but no, that was the only thing that was in the basement that could possibly be on this line. I did have to chuckle. I didn't remember that cans in the early 70s actually had expiration dates. I thought expiration dates it was something that came along much more recently and not on canned food in the early 70s.
Well, and I think that was another mechanism that they were using to show Phyllis being condescending to the African American assistant that she had. Now, did you have someone in your home who was African American?
We did, and she worked for my mother for 40 years.
And what was your relationship like with her?
So her name was Willie B. Reed, and my relationship was very close with her. I thought she was marvelous. She was a great cook, and I learned a multitude of things from her.
Well, that speaks very well of her, certainly. Well, lots more about the race issue and all kinds of other fun things. Join us for our next episode, which will review episode 4 of Mrs. America. And thank you again for being with us.
My pleasure, Colleen.
Thank you.